past 3 episodes have dealt in detail with 3 of the 4 core performance skills, those being sight reading, playing by ear, and transposing. Today, we're going to talk about the 4th and the final of the 4 core performance skills. Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 88. My name is David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. So this is the 5th in a row of a series all about the 4 core performance skills, and I knew that this would be at least a 5-part series. Thought it might be right at 5 parts. There will be a 6th part. I'm not sure if it'll be the next week or very soon after. There'll be kind of a summary episode and just maybe looking at all 4 core skills again, just in a way to kind of bring everything to a close. So we might call that a coda episode. I'm not sure. But anyways, one more episode in this series. But before we do that, I have to get to the final of the core performance skills that we're going to talk about. Now, what are the 4 core performance skills? If this is your first podcast episode on the Musician Toolkit, then first of all, I welcome you. You can start at any point. If you want to find out more about the 4 core performance skills, I would advise you to go back to episode 84 where I introduced them and I talk about them. And also check out the previous episodes that deal with those specific skills. So the 4 core performance skills are the big skills that I think you need to be able to play well in any situation, any type of performance situation. Things that, people might ask you to do, things you might want to do yourself in order to play a piece of music. And so far we've covered the ability to sight read, which, again, just to kind of elaborate, that is not just playing music for the first time. It is doing well the first time you read music, but the big skill is reading from a piece of music. But it's not taking 100 times playing the music to do well. It's doing pretty well the first time you play it. So that's why I put an emphasis on sight reading rather than just reading music, but it is all part of the same skill set. And then we also, on episode 86, we talked about playing by ear. And then on episode 87, last week, we talked about the ability to transpose. And also, just a quick reminder, I'm not talking about what I call sub-skills, which is technique, knowledge of music theory, knowledge of music history, ear training, memorization, and probably a few others. These are not the core performance skills because they are part of the performance skills. It's like you cannot do any of these things without good technique. You can't do any of these things well without a knowledge of music theory and so forth. So we get to improvising today, and I find this kind of amusing because this is the skill that I bet if I was to survey a bunch of random musicians, and actually I have randomly asked some musicians this before, but I think if I was to take a larger sample size, I would expect that this is the skill that would probably get the most division on confidence in being able to do that. I think the other 3 skills, you might have some people who are like, I'm okay at it. I'm not that good, but I'm not terrible. Improvisation, probably more than anything else, is the skill where people are like, I love doing that, or I can't do that. And I just want to push back right away. If you've said, I can't improvise, bring a toddler over to my house who has just learned to walk and is just tall enough to reach the keys of my piano. And if he's even slightly extroverted, let me show him where the piano is, show him how it works, how you push a key and you make sound. And they will proceed to improvise. They will take their hands, they will bang those keys, they will go sometimes right in one spot, sometimes they'll try a different spot, and you'll see them kind of laughing while they do that. It's a very joyful thing. And guess what? That is improvising. If a toddler in diapers who just learned to walk and doesn't even really speak more than a handful of words, if they can improvise, you can improvise. So Yes, I know the next thing that we would say is yes, but that might be kind of inaccessible. There are things that you can get away with when you're younger that you can't get away with when you're older. It's like an adult goes to the piano and does that. We start wondering, well, what's wrong with this person? So obviously when we talk about a performance skill, we are talking about controlled improvisation, willful improvising. In other words, you're making up music freely on the spot, but you have parameters in place. You have rules for this piece of music. Some of those rules might be we're going to stay centered in the key of G major. And that means even if you depart temporarily, you're still with this idea that you've got to come back to the key of G, or you've got to mainly hang around chords and notes that seem to point to key of G being your center for the piece. It might be that you're going to play on nothing but the black keys. So you have nothing but basically an all flat, all sharp pentatonic scale, and you make up your piece like that. So I haven't really gotten into, how to do better at improvising, but I think this is just kind of a starter rule. When we start talking about this, to do well, give yourself some parameters. Now, the more parameters you give yourself, the more challenging it is. Or I should say, the more challenging it is to come up with anything that you think sounds really amazing. I could say, I just want you to take D flat and E flat, those two notes, improvise. You can come up with something that sounds just fine, but you probably won't come up with anything that sounds amazing. If you do, record it and send it to me, because I would love to hear an amazing piece that uses just two notes. All right, so why is improvising so important? Why is it what I consider to be a core skill? The first one is it is the oldest way that we make music in the history of humanity. I mean, this isn't quite a chicken or the egg problem, but I think you can imagine the first time someone learned a piece of music was not them learning a piece of music that already existed. The music had to exist first. And just like all forms of language, an oral tradition preceded the written tradition by quite a bit. As far as I've been told, we do not have anything that we would regard as music notation that is older than about 1,600 years. Now, I may be doing the math wrong, maybe more like 1,500 years. But yeah, if it's a time period discussed by texts like the Bible, there's no compositions from that time period. However, books like that speak of making music. The impulse to make up music, just to burst into song, goes back thousands of years before the first written note. And I'm sure it was a lot easier to just make up your own song than to just repeat something you've heard. But over the years, I'm sure that families made up songs. They shared them they sang them for their friends picked them up, they sang them to their children, and before you know it, you have folk songs. But that all started from improvisation. It was someone who felt the urge to, with or without words, come up with some kind of music, some kind of melody. Another reason why improvising is important is I've used the word liberating quite a bit. In fact, that's the thing. It's like, if you can sight read well, you can put any piece of music in front of you and learn how to play it. If you can play by ear, you don't need any sheet music in front of you to learn how to play. You can just listen to it. If you can transpose well, you don't have to stay in the key of either the sound clip that you listen to or the sheet music in front of you. But the most liberating, I believe, is improvising, because you can make up whatever music you want without having to see it, without having to hear it, just because you are able to improvise. And then the third reason that I'll mention for why improvising is important, I think it is the ultimate demonstration of understanding how music works. To improvise music well, in other words, not to sound like the toddler who in diapers going up to the piano and just kind of banging on it. In order to make some music that sounds at least good, if not great, if not awesome, requires you to understand how music works, how to deconstruct it, and how to then put those elements back together with your own personality, with your own voice, with your own understanding. And when you experiment with music as you improvise, you're learning more about it, and and it feeds your overall musicianship. Now, what are some situations where it might be handy to know improvisation, where it's handy to know how to improvise? So first of all, if you play any genre that's not classical, so playing jazz, rock, anything else, especially where as an instrumentalist, you're expected to do a solo that has not been written down. So jazz and rock, these are very common. And sometimes if you play in musical theater, if you're playing a certain type of show, this will pop up. It'll say piano, improvise for 8 measures. Saxophone, improvise for 16 measures. Might give you chord symbols, might give you a prompt of what kind of style you have. And of course, you have a tempo. But improvising is expected in those situations. Another situation where it comes in handy is if you are playing background music. So think of like a dinner party or a banquet, and you're just kind of playing music in the background, and just maybe you didn't bring enough music with you, or someone says, hey, look, we'll pay you a little bit extra, but could you keep playing for another 30 minutes, another one more hour? And maybe you've run out of music. Well, if you can make up music in the style of everything else you've been playing, that is one way to fill the gap. One way that I have been using it for well over 30 years is in my time here and there as a church pianist. One of the jobs of a church pianist is not just to play hymns and to accompany, the choir or soloists or something like that, but it's to play instrumental selections throughout a service. So for me, it is a prelude, an offertory, and a postlude. And I can count the number of times on, maybe 2 hands, but possibly 1 hand. Definitely no more than 2 hands in those 30 plus years where I have taken a piece of music and played it as is for either a prelude, offertory, or postlude. Most of those times, I am improvising an arrangement of some existing material, usually a hymn, maybe something a little bit more contemporary. Sometimes, maybe a classical theme, but that is something that I decided early on, I really love doing this. And sometimes I work out those improvisations way in advance and polish them like I would any other piece. And other times, I just sit down and I just play. I write down what I'm going to play, what the title of the piece is, what the melody is. And I might even put what key I'm going to start in. Just have a few prompts and then I just go. The past few years, that has been what I've done. I have very little done anything, and I am perfectly fine with that. I love the spontaneity that comes from just improvising in those situations. There's one more way that improvising had a profound effect on my life. I'm going to share a video in the show notes. It's from YouTube. It's from my YouTube channel from, I believe, about 9 years ago. I think it was 2015. I did a piano concert, and, included a lot of things. I think it included some Brahms. It included probably either Mozart or Beethoven sonata. I don't remember, and a few other things. And I decided to leave a spot for a piano improvisation. And what I did was I prompted the audience, and you can hear this on the video. I prompted them for 4 notes, asked 4 different people to give me 4 different notes. And then I asked for 3 different moods. And then I sat down and played. I'd never practiced either before. And I think it's about 5-6 minutes of music, and it develops as it goes because I kind of listen to where it's heading, and I always just keeping those 4 notes in mind is like, this is my main motive, and also the moods that were given to me as I proceed. So maybe check that out. This might give you some kind of ideas, and just seeing that at work. Also seeing me practice what I'm preaching. That video was found by 2 of the writers that I've collaborated with on 4 different musicals now. I've been their arranger since 2016, and the thing that really impressed them was finding that video. They were very impressed what I was able to do with a basic amount of material and create something big out of it, and that was exactly who they were looking for, someone who could take their songs, which were not big yet, and make them big, try to make them spectacular. One more thing I want to say, I've said this before, but again, everybody's podcast episode is their first. It's worth repeating, and it's been a while since I've said this. Improvisation is a different skill than composition, more so than just what it really means. Improvisation means you're making up music freely. Composition means that you're writing it down. Now, I've said this before. What I mean by composition being different, I mean the craft of composition and what goes into making a good composition versus a good improvisation. A lot of composers, especially when they're getting started, are actually just transcribing their improvisations. Like they might press record while they play, and then they take a part they like and they write it down. Composition is more of like chipping away, part of the stone in a sculpture. It's until you have the shape that you want. It's really thinking hard about how the lines go together and coming up with just the right notes and the right chords and so forth. And something that you want to have is kind of like your permanent thing that you play. So that is what I consider composition to be. Improvisation, again, it's freely made up music. And both of these are valuable, but composition is not a performance skill. It is a compositional skill. So we won't be talking about composition, but we will be talking about improvisation. There are two types of improvisations that you should practice. So I'm going to be going over some things that you can do when you practice. And two things that you can do, you can improvise original material. In other words, you're making up the melody, you're making up the chords, you're making up everything. Something else that you should do, and it might be a better way of getting started if this is really uncomfortable, is to improvise arrangements of existing material. This is what I do every Sunday in church, anywhere from 1 to 3 times per service. I'm not just playing whatever music I want, I'm finding things people know. It might be something like Amazing Grace, it might be something like In the Garden, but it's hymns that the church knows, and I'm going to improvise them in such a way that I could actually repeat the melodies throughout the year fairly frequently and completely change the style of what I'm doing. So as I've done with the 3 previous episodes, I want to give you 10 exercises. And I'm going to be a little bit more interactive with this episode so that you can hear the ideas that I discuss. So I'll be playing these ideas on the keyboard, or at least some of them as I talk about them. So if you've never really improvised before, at least if you've never improvised anything original, the first few steps that I would suggest is let's just take a melody. And of course, if you're not doing this on the piano, if you're just doing this on, like a woodwind or a brass instrument, you are really only thinking about one line at a time. So this is going to be the most helpful. But let's start off with just understanding a melodic sequence. So a sequence is simply taking a pattern and duplicating it in every possible way except for the notes you're playing them on. So, for example, if you go C, D, E, that is starting on a C, going up a step, going up a step. A sequence is when you start on any other note and go up a step and up a step. So D, E, F, G, A. Now you may be hearing this and saying, yeah, but those are not exactly the same things because you have half steps in different places. Well, look, there are exact sequences where every half step and whole step are the same, and then there are diatonic sequences, which means that it's staying within the scale and your half steps and whole steps might shift around a little bit, which is actually, what's happening with a lot of pieces that you hear. So the first thing we want to do is do a melodic sequence, but we have to start off with a motive. We have to start off with a pattern. So let's keep this really easy and let's start in the key of C, or, if you're playing on a different instrument, take the key that is most natural for you. And I want you to come up with a 4-note or a 5-note pattern within the range of an octave. So let's put some limitations. We don't want to just be all over the instruments. Keep your lowest to highest note within an octave. So the notes I'm going to use is going to be C, F, E, G, D, and I want to come up with a rhythm. So I'm going to put that with 4/8 notes and a half note. So C, F, E, G, D. And just practice that, repeat it until you can play it consistently that same way each time. So you really know these 5 notes you've just come up with. So now you want to take those 4 or 5 notes that you came up with, and you just want to move them up a step. So it's not really transposing, but it's just stay in the key of C, but start on a different note and do the same generic intervals. So don't think about whether that, if you went up a third, it doesn't matter if it's a major or minor third, it's just a third up to the next note within the scale. And this is what is called a sequence, but keep that same rhythm. Now just keep going up and down the scale to hear how that pattern sounds as you start on the next note of the scale. And then also try coming back down. Finally, try changing the mode. So if you came up with something that seems to be in a major key, change it to minor. If you started in minor, change it to major. So for me, I go back to that C, F, E, G, D that I came up with, and it's going to be C, F, E flat, G, D. Another basic thing you want to do with your material. So we're going to stick with these same 4 or 5 notes you came up with. I'll do the same. The second thing that you can do is called melodic inversions. So you want to take your same 4 or 5 note pattern and again, analyze the intervals. It doesn't matter if it's major, minor, perfect, but just 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, whatever it is. So when I look at mine, it goes up a 4th, down a 2nd, up a 3rd, and down a 4th. So I'm simply going to change what goes up to down and what goes down to up. So I'll start on the C, and instead of going up a 4th, I'll go down a 4th. And then instead of going down a 2nd, I'll go up a 2nd, and so on. So my inverted pattern, starting on the same C, is going to be C, G, A, F, B. Now, move that around across the scale, and just listen to how that sounds. Okay, so the third thing that we'll do is take those 2 basic melodic ideas, so your motive that you can create sequences with, and the inverted pattern that you can create sequences with. And feel free to vary a note or 2 occasionally, sometimes change the rhythm, maybe add a few notes to each pattern, maybe do a fragment of the pattern, and construct a short piece of music from start to finish. The fourth thing that you can do is to take the same exercise you just did. It's actually the first 3 exercises you just did. So work on coming up with a sequence, work on coming up with an inversion and then the sequence of that, and then put those together, varying the notes, changing the rhythms, and coming up with your own piece. But this is where you pair this with transposition. So try this exercise in a variety of different keys. Whether or not you want to do all of the keys is up to you, but at least do a few keys. And remember, there are no ironclad rules as to what you can and what you can't do within a piece. And one of the characteristics of improvising is freedom. It always must be free. So not only should you not expect when you go to a different key to play what you just did in the key of C, but it actually shouldn't happen. It should be different than the last time you played it. In fact, every time you change the key, try to be a little different this time. And, I didn't mention it, but yes, I would record it. Record what you're doing, because you might come up with something you really like, and you can listen to it and then incorporate the skill of playing by ear to your own improvisation. Okay, we're still on the same exercise for number 5, but this is mainly if you play piano or a self-accompanying instrument. Add some chords. If you're not comfortable with that, add some 2-note harmonies or even just a single note in the other hand to support these melodic ideas. All right, the sixth thing that you can do is to practice specific scales, arpeggios, and chord progressions by improvising etudes based on one specific skill at a time. It's been almost exactly 1 year since I released episode 37, and it's the only episode I've done to date that was inspired in response to a listener question. I happened to mention the idea of coming up with your own practice etude, and this listener asked if I could elaborate on how to do that. And so I actually create some practice etudes on the spot, based on her questions. I believe it was for French horn was her instrument. So that is episode 37. You can find that in the show notes. The title of that episode is Composing Your Own Practice Etudes. But this is a way to take the routine or the tedium out of practicing your technique, and that is to take your technique and make it the feature of a piece that you're doing. And if you want some ideas, I'd really recommend, get some etudes designed for your instrument and just see what the types of things they do are. All right, the seventh thing that you can do is to take a hymn or a folk song and transform it. Here are some ways that you can transform it. You can change the meter. So if it was 4/4, make it 3/4. If it was 3/4, make it 4/4. Maybe get inventive. Let's try it in 6/8. I've taken some Christmas tunes and put them in 7/8. It's really up to you. And also think about maybe trying it in a specific style. So like, what would the piece sound like if it was a bossa nova? What would it sound like if it was in the style of Mozart or another composer from that era? So, that really good way to do that, again, on the piano is an Alberti bass pattern. Take a 3-note chord and go bottom note, top note, middle note, top note. And all of a sudden it's going to sound like it could be from Mozart if the melody blends in with those chords, and it's mostly primary chords. I haven't done a whole lot on TikTok, but I did record one time. If you go to my profile on TikTok, it's David Lane Music. And, just look at my profile. I have a pinned video at the top. It's the one that's been most successful. It's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer as a tango. It's actually something I came up with long before TikTok, but, I played it for someone and they loved it. And, it's kind of like a little party request. But this is the type of thing you can do when you improvise. Take things that already exist and let's transform it. Let's do something that you haven't actually heard, but you think it might be fun to do. All right, the eighth thing you can do is another exercise, and I call these chord progression variations. So take a chord progression from any piece. So you could take the canon in D, which is actually 8 chords over and over. But you don't have to do that much. You could take a blues progression, which is 4 measures of a 1 chord, 2 measures of a 4, 2 measures of a 1, 1 measure of a 5, 1 measure of a 4, and then 2 measures of a 1, but typically that last measure is not a 1 unless you're actually finished. It could be like a 5/7. If that's a lot, that is something you can easily Google, 12 measure, 12 bar blues progression. And, you'll find some help there. But any kind of a chord progression that you play over and over with your left hand, you can modify the styles. Like if you're comfortable, you can do broken chords. You can do, bigger voicings, jump around octaves. You can do all kinds of things. But the important thing is keep the chords steady and play whatever you want in the right hand, but just try to make it fit. But actually, maybe that's the wrong thing to say. No, you can try to make it fit if you want. Be free with what you play along with the chords. You can try conservative approaches. So try to make the melody sound like what you would expect, what you think others would expect to hear against those chords. So in other words, you're playing a C chord, C, E, and G. Those are some good notes to put in there. But why don't you also try some wild approaches? Try playing some things that are really out of key that go against it. So there are no wrong approaches. There are only different approaches. All right, the ninth exercise that you can do, the ninth suggestion, we'll call this mood improvisation. So I just want you to think of a single word and play what comes to mind when you think of that word. You can use words like anxious, celebration, sadness, adventure, and just start playing. And be sure to listen closely to the music that you're making and try taking it various places. Maybe try to go from one mood to another. Like you're anxious and celebration. What would that be like? It's probably like real life for most of you, right? You have days where you're anxious and then all of a sudden you start to feel good, or things were going great. Now you're having some anxious moments. You could even think of a single image: being on the beach, being caught in a thunderstorm, being in a horse-drawn carriage. Come up with your own picture, your own mood, and just play what you're thinking of, and don't worry about whether or not that's the music you're supposed to be playing. This is the thing. You have to get this out of your head when you're improvising. There's nothing you're supposed to be playing. There's only what you're playing right now. And it just, as you allow yourself to explore, you'll come up with things that you like and maybe some things that you don't like. But it's a way to kind of learn about music and how music makes you feel and how you respond to certain moods with the music. So this should be a free, completely spontaneous exercise. No rules with the melody, no rules with the chords. Just let your hands play while holding on to a mood. And sometimes this is really easy to do. I'll tell you how I got into composing, and it was through improvising. And it was improvising a piece of music that I felt compelled to play. After the first time in high school, I was very shy. I finally had the courage to ask a girl out on a date, and she said no. And in the sadness of that, I came up with something that my mom heard and, encouraged me to write down. In other words, it was a transcribed improvisation, just like I said, a lot of early compositions are. I was not even thinking of being a music major until I did that. I played piano I'd been taking lessons since just before first grade. But it was never going to be anything other than a hobby until I discovered through improvisation the world of composition. And I've never discarded improvisation. And that was just from this exercise, this mood exercise. Sometimes you don't have to think of a mood. The mood is there. Go work on your improvisation when you're feeling those moods. All right, the 10th and final thing, as you're working on any of these exercises, keep pushing the technical, melodic, and harmonic difficulty of what you play. Keep pushing and pushing. Ultimately, what you play when you're improvising should sound just as sophisticated, just as demanding as the most difficult piece of music that you can play with a written music score or whether you're playing by ear. Your sight reading may never quite be at the level of the hardest music you can play. Your transposing ability may never quite be at the ability of the hardest music that you can play. But your improvisation, it should match the most difficult music you can play. So that is it. We have gone over all 4 core performance skills. What skills are the ones that you struggle with the most? The ones that you need the most work? What's a skill that you were really not very comfortable with that you worked on and got better? I've told you mine was sight reading. I was very awful at sight reading and I got much better. If you'd like to share your story with your voice, I'd be happy to listen to your story and possibly include it on a future episode. You can go to speakpipe.com/musician toolkit. If you don't want to share with your voice, you can share in a message. Go to davidlanemusic.com. There's a contact form on the bottom. You can share whatever you would like. So again, I will have more episodes on the topic. I'll have one more episode soon to talk more about this. And actually what the topic is going to be how I'm going to be handling these skills in my lessons coming forward. So it is an episode that I'll definitely want my students to listen to. But it might inspire you if you're guiding your own education, or if you can request things of your teacher, or if you are a teacher and wants to include these skills in lessons, it might give you some ideas of your own. So again, I don't know if that's next week. If it's not next week, it's probably 3 weeks from now, because I am anticipating having a guest again in a couple of weeks, and want to stick to that schedule. So we'll see. Next week might be a shorter one-off episode, but we will see. I am not quite settled as I'm recording this episode right now. All right, before I ramble any further, let me just remind you, please share this episode if you got any value out of it. Share it to your social media, share it in an email and a text to anybody who you think might get some benefit from it. And that is my only request for right now. Anything else you'd like to do is gravy. If you want to click a like on YouTube, if you want to give me a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you're allowed to do that, that is great too. But sharing is the best way to let others know about this podcast. So good luck with practicing your improvisation skills, making those better and better. And I look forward to being back with you again next week. Until then, thank you so much for listening.